A fascinating feature of the Wexford countryside is the ruins of country mansions, or as we prefer to call them, the big houses. Burned out shells of classical architecture, some in ruins, others obliterated from the landscape. Symbols of wealth and a class system from the past, but they were also a showpiece for the best Irish craftsmanship using native materials. Irish oak was converted into staircases and banisters, wainscoting thick solid front doors and ceilings. Carved oak turned into decorative art and beauty. A century ago, between 1921 and 1923, during the War of Independence and the Civil War, 9 great Wexford houses were burned to the ground. Ballyrankin House was built around 1840 on the edge of the River Slaney, a few kilometres south of Bunclody. 2 stories and a 3-bay front, embellished by a large porch supported by 4 iconic columns. Above the porch was an ornamental row of pillars. A flight of stairs crept up to the doorway. There was a 2-storey annex above a basement. Ballyrankin was the seat of the Devericks family, who occupied over 2,300 acres of land in County Wexford in 1878. Walter Screen purchased Ballyrankin in April 1912, when the sinking of the Titanic was dominating world news. Walter Screen was from Bath in England. He farmed in Canada, returned to live in Kildare before coming to reside and farm at Ballyrankin House. Walter was the husband of distinguished poet Agnes Screen, who composed her work under the pseudonym Moira O'Neill. They became the proud parents of the talented novelist and playwright Molly Keane, who in her early literary career used the pseudonym M.J. Farrell. Ballyrankin was an impressive residence with grandeur and character. It was enhanced by fine architectural mouldings, particularly around the windows, and it could be argued that the back view, looking across the River Slaney, held its own in relation to elegance of the main entrance. Even the stables and the outhouses were a trademark of brilliant stonework from the local quarries. They emerged with the rear of the house. A further distance away were the garden and orchard that provided sustenance for the family. The winding avenue was an elegant approach for horse-drawn carriages, but all of that changed dramatically. Walter Screen had the misfortune of witnessing his mansion go up in flames during the War of Independence in July 1921. He received £11,300 in compensation and bought the adjoining house known as Newlands, which became the present Ballyrankin House. When Walter Screen died in 1930, he was succeeded by his son, and to this day the Screen family farmed the land, and every day they passed the ruins of Ballyrankin House. The destruction of Ballyrankin will remain a mystery. Local tradition claims it was a reprisal for the burning of Maggie Doyle's house at Cremog, just a few miles away. The real story was lost somewhere in the ashes and the fading local memory. Today the ruins of Ballyrankin House stand still in a peaceful wooded location. A place that once inspired literary genius has become a sanctuary for the wild birds in a natural environment. Ardamine was a fine 19th century country mansion of 2 stories over a basement. It was likely built as a wedding present for John Richards and Anne Ward in July 1821. Exactly 100 years later, on July 9, 1921, Ardamine House was burned in the Troubles. Major Richards had been away in England for about 14 months, but he had not removed any furniture. On the night of the burning, it was 1 o'clock in the morning. The gardener John Carr and his wife and daughter were the only occupants. 20 armed men presented at the front door. The leader of the gang symbolically shook hands with John Carr and his terrified wife and said he was sorry for having to burn the place. Ardamine was one of the best equipped residences. A splendid electric plant had been installed at a cost of £1,000. A sad Major Richards visited the smouldering residence, accompanied by an architect with a view to computing the cost of the destruction. He abandoned the plan and left Ireland for good. Ardtramont House was built towards the end of the 18th century, around 1770 to 1780. Its windows faced south with a commanding view of Wexford Harbour. The original mansion was described as a large quadrangular courtly building of long standing. The building we see today is a replacement. The original Ardtramont House was burned to the ground in February 1923. Since no traces of a basement was ever found, it is presumed that it never had one. The Esmond family has been prominent in Gorey since the Anglo-Norman era. The family seat was at Ballynastragh, and the one member of the family was executed in Dublin during the rebellion of 1798. Ballynastragh was originally a 17th century house built by James Esmond. It was enlarged and modernised. It became a house of mid-18th century appearance. Further embellished and slightly castellated in the 19th century with the help of architect George Ashlin. A slender 5-storey battlemented tower was added on one side. Sir Thomas Esmond was the first chairman of Wexford County Council, a position he held for 10 years from 1899 until 1909. He returned to the Senate in the Irish Free State in 1922 as an independent. On March 9, 1923, while attending a meeting in London, he received the dreadful news. The family seat at Ballynastragh was destroyed by fire, and the flames could be seen miles away in Gorey. All the family and historical documents were reduced to ashes in the Great Fire of 1923. Arguably, the greatest loss of all was the extensive library. Sir Thomas Esmond continued as a senator until 1934. He died in 1935, and the following year Ballynastragh House was completed and the family returned to live there again. The present Ballynastragh House was a replacement in the Georgian style by Dermot Gogarty. It is much smaller. This is the grand entrance to Farmlee House, located on the N80 between Enniscorthy and Bunclody. It attracts attention and prompts questions about its heritage and history. But the fact is that this entrance does not belong here. Farmlee was occupied by John Corcoran from 1960 when he purchased a house and farm. He was a bookmaker from Wexford, and he was so impressed by the attractive cut stone work that once graced the entrance to Castleboro, he purchased the entrance and had it reconstructed here, opposite a small gate lodge that has long since disappeared. The entrance piers have a significance. The feature of the design, the letter C intertwined and reversed. C for Corcoran, C for Carew. The entrance piers and gates belonged here, the grand entrance to Castleboro House. Locals are wondering if Queen Victoria was one of the great figures to have passed this way in an ornamented horse and carriage. The great and the good, the wealthy and the privileged passed this architecturally pleasing gate lodge. It still radiates its architectural importance to this very day, nurtured by nature long after the sound of passing hooves and carriage wheels has grown silent. It all started at Ballyborack Castle, 3 floors high and still a prominent ruin on the landscape. But Robert Chaplin Carew renamed it Castleboro when he arrived in 1770. Castleboro was the largest and loveliest of mansions. The elegant 3-storey central block was 90 feet long. The east wing and the west wing were each 55 feet long. It had 39 windows in the front of the house and 35 apartments above the basement, an extensive library and an amazing staircase. Castleboro was described in the compensation court as 2.5 times the size of Wilton Castle. Now that is big. His son, also Robert Chaplin Carew, succeeded his father in 1829. 5 years later, in 1834, he became the first Lord Carew and dreamed of building himself a fine mansion. Martin Day had drawn up this plan in 1822. This classical house was designed by the celebrated architect Daniel Robertson, and his collaborator was an equally well-known architect of the time. His name was Martin Day. There was a mansion here before this edifice, but it burned down. Only the west wing survived, and it was cleverly incorporated into this new building. Castleboro was not finally completed until 1858. By this time, it had cost £84,000. And to keep it going, it was located on 17,000 acres of land. Lady Jane Carew was a good Ballyhogue woman who hailed from Bellevue, and she became the first Lady Carew. Her achievement did not stop there. She was 102 years old when she died in 1901 and had lived in 3 centuries. Lord and Lady Carew shared her eternal rest at the entrance to Killegny Church, which was located on the estate. It was a Monday night shortly after 10 o'clock. There was a deadly knock on the door at the farm steward's house, 200 or 300 yards from the mansion. Armed men demanded the keys to a nearby store where barrels of paraffin oil were stored. The barrels were rolled towards the mansion. Some hay was also brought along. Entry was gained through the French bay windows smashed by rifle butts. The noise of breaking glass was plainly audible back at the steward's house. Then there was an eerie silence. Hay was soaked in paraffin oil and scattered inside the mansion. Soon tongues of flame were leaping skywards. High winds were blowing. Within hours, Castleboro was destroyed. The ruins of Castleboro are amongst the most famous in the country. 100 years after its destruction, the queries continue about its history, the family who lived there, the servants and the locals who worked the land, the mills, the forges, and the women who were maids and servants. Did Queen Victoria visit Castleboro as a young girl? That is a myth which is disappointing in its historical context. However, the Duke of Clarence spent 6 days hunting with the Wexford hounds while he stayed at Castleboro. Unfortunately, he drank contaminated water from the well and died of typhoid fever 6 days later. Another bad ending at Castleboro, the largest and loveliest mansion in Ireland. The building of Colbawn House began in 1823. It took almost 40 years to complete. So much money was lavishly spent that it was known as Bruin's Folly. It was impressive, 100 feet long, built of fine white cut stone in the Tudor Revival style. In 1917, Colbawn House changed ownership. Henry Bruin sold the estate to James Dyer of Clonroach. But tragedy struck on February the 28th, 1923. When the place was ravaged by fire, Colbawn became a ruin. There is nothing left of Bellevue House except a church open for worship. There are small vestiges of farm buildings and, of course, the famous Ballyhug wall that once surrounded the estate. George Ogle gave Bellevue the name after he purchased an estate and built a mansion at Ballyhug in 1737. Anthony Cliff arrived in 1825 and most likely rebuilt the house. Living the high life in a mansion was no obstacle to longevity. Jane Catherine Cliff was born at Bellevue in 1799. She married the first Lord Carew and became Lady Carew. Bellevue House was burned down on January 28, 1923. It had 9 reception rooms and 8 bedrooms. It stood on 1,000 acres of land. The ruins were demolished and taken away. The entrance piers are inviting us all into a history lesson on the past. Wilton Castle was a splendid castellated residence located on the River Boro and is forever associated with the Alcock family. But the story of Wilton Castle goes back much further in the pages of history. Its earliest existence is traced back to 1247, when William de Den was in residence. It was known as Clochnaguare, the Castle of the Sheep. The ancient castle of Clochnaguare was built by Sir Fulk Furlong in the 14th century, and around 1420 Furlong held the barony and the castle for the Earl of Pembroke. Next came Edward Butler, Baron of Cahir, who rebuilt and restored the castle and added a mansion in 1599. But the estates of the Butlers were confiscated by Oliver Cromwell, who granted the lands of Wilton to Captain Robert Thornhill. Thornhill's son sold Clochnaguare to William Alcock in 1695. Alcock rebuilt the castle and renamed his estate Wilton. The Alcocks managed Wilton for almost 2¼ centuries. Alcock's existence was very low-key until the general election of 1807. William Congreve Alcock and his friend and potential brother-in-law, John Coakley, were rival candidates. They had a clash of opinions. They fell out and there was anger in the air, and they mutually decided to settle their differences in the proud, gentlemanly fashion of the time, pistols at dawn. This was the last public duel in County Wexford. May the 13th, 1807 was the date. The venue, Ardcandrisk, overlooking the River Slaney and a few kilometres from Wexford town. Alcock discharged his weapon first. A loud bang rang out. Coakley fell to the ground. Alcock's bullet had pierced his heart and killed him. Between 1841 and 1844, Harry Alcock was in charge at Wilton, and he felt some changes were needed. He engaged with Daniel Robertson, one of the finest architects of his time. They executed an extensive restoration plan. The imposing tower of Mount Leinster granite was added. It complemented the existing 3-storey adjoining and the older polygon tower and turret, with the Alcock date 1695 carved high upon it. This gave Wilton Castle the shape and appearance that we admire today. The political situation was unstable in the early days of the 20th century. Burning the big house became a hazard. On the night of March 5th, 1923, bright flames ravished Wilton Castle. It was a Monday night. The local newspaper said that upwards of 30 men were involved. Some carried arms, others arrived bearing tins of oil. Wilton had been unoccupied for 14 months. Alcock and his wife and family were in England. Wilton Castle was left in charge of the caretaker James Stynes, who occupied rooms within the castle. Stynes was next door that night, visiting the caretaker George Windsor at the steward's residence. It was 9 o'clock when a loud knock was heard at the door. Both men were confronted by an armed gang in order to hand over the keys of the castle. One of them said, "We have come to burn down the place. We are sorry." They could hear windows being smashed. They knew what was happening. They were powerless to do anything. The caretaker and steward were on their guard until the raiders left around midnight. They were gutted to see the building enveloped in flames. Every room was ablaze. Flames were fanned by blowing wind. Any attempt to save the building was hopeless. The roof fell in, floors collapsed. Soon nothing was left but begrimed roofless walls, broken glass, and a mound of smouldering debris. Captain Philip Alcock was devastated at the loss of his mansion. He had no insurance. He claimed £100,000, but only received about a tenth of that figure. For many years he had a sincere desire of returning to Wexford and rebuilding his mansion, but this was not to be. Captain Alcock and his wife, always referred to as Mrs. Alcock, had 4 daughters, Kathleen, Philippa, Margaret and Mary. Mary Galloway lived in Waterford and often took family members to Wilton Castle, meeting and renewing acquaintances with Peter Doyle of the Garden and George Windsor, who lived in the steward's house. They would picnic on the lawn with a fine bottle of wine and wonder if the castle had survived the fire, how different would their lifestyle be. Mary often said that her dad was sincere in his dream to come back to Wilton and rebuild his Irish home, but his wife was not too keen on the idea, and it never happened. However, thanks to Sean Windsor, a large part of Wilton Castle has been restored in the style of its heyday as reflected in the old Lawrence photographs, which are used in this presentation. Wilton Castle has risen from the ashes. It is now possible to spend nights in the dreams of the Alcocks and experience a history and heritage that has seen centuries of joy, strife, turmoil, and above all, been the custodian of thousands of acres of land in central County Wexford. On the edge of Kilmuckridge, Upton House was an impressive gentleman's residence, 2 stories high above a basement, a 5-bay front with an impressive Venetian window in the centre, overlooking a plain porch. It was rented to various tenants and held a low profile as a country house residence until it was purchased by the Bryan family. Its early history appears to have vanished, but all of that changed when it was burned to the ground on the 14th of March 1923. On the fateful night of destruction, Upton House was unoccupied. The owner, Colonel Loftus Bryan, and his secretary, Mr. Linden, who normally lived at Upton, were at his other residence, Bournemouth Manor overlooking the River Slaney at Ardamine. Lost in the blaze were some antique articles, several oil paintings, and a valuable library of books. When Bryan and Linden arrived back at Upton, they were faced with a useless shell dominated by a few chimney stacks. Soon after 10 o'clock on that night, a group of men arrived in Kilmuckridge. People out and about were advised to go home. Soon afterwards, leaping flames lit up the night sky. Upton House was no more. Solsborough survived the War of Independence and the Civil War, but I have added it here as a bonus because we have the pictures, and many queries ask, why did Solsborough burn down? The house was 19th century, but the Richards family had been there since 1788. Solsborough was the headquarters of General Lake, whose army led the attack on the insurgents on Vinegar Hill on June 21st, 1798. The last member of the family to live at Solsborough was Roland Richards, who died in March 1935, 2 years after the house was burned down. Solsborough accidentally burned down on April 19, 1933. It happened at midday when the snowboards and other timbers on the roof caught fire. The estimated cost of rebuilding was £33,000, too much in 1948, It was replaced by a small building and finally demolished around 1980. Solsborough is fondly remembered. A number of gate lodges survive. The members of the Richards family lie in their eternal sleep in a private graveyard by the banks of the Slaney, and is accessible by crossing the Wexford to Dublin railway line.